My sister told everyone I was just using our parents for money, so they took her side. But what I sent them back left them silent. I'm 29 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I thought I knew exactly where I stood with my family. Turns out I was living in a fantasy world, and my sister Victoria was about to shatter it completely. Let me paint you a picture of my life for the past 7 years. While Victoria was off building her career as a marketing executive in Los Angeles, living in her overpriced apartment and posting Instagram stories from trendy restaurants, I was back home in Ohio taking care of our parents. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Dad had his first heart attack when I was 22, fresh out of college with a business degree and about a dozen job offers in different cities. Victoria was already established in California by then, making good money and building what she called her personal brand. When Dad's second heart attack hit 2 years later, followed by Mom's diabetes diagnosis, someone needed to step up. Victoria's response was to send flowers and call once a week. My response was to move back home. I took a job at the local credit union, nothing glamorous, but steady work that let me be there when Mom needed rides to her endocrinologist appointments or when Dad had to go in for his cardiac checkups. The pay wasn't amazing, but I wasn't paying rent either. Mom insisted I stay in my old room, said it made her feel safer having me around. Victoria would visit maybe twice a year, usually around holidays, and spend most of her time taking photos for social media and complaining about how boring our hometown was. She'd make these comments about how I was wasting my potential and how I should think about my future. Easy for her to say when she wasn't the one helping Dad with his medication schedule or grocery shopping with Mom when her vision got blurry. The thing is, I genuinely love being home. Sure, I missed out on some opportunities, and yeah, dating was complicated when you're 29 and living with your parents. But watching old movies with Dad on Sunday afternoons and helping Mom with her garden made me happier than any corner office could. Then 3 months ago, everything started changing. Dad's cardiologist recommended a procedure that wasn't covered by insurance. Something about a specialized stent that could dramatically improve his quality of life, but it would cost $15,000 out of pocket. Mom's diabetes medication had gotten more expensive too, and even with Medicare, they were struggling to cover everything. I didn't hesitate. I've been saving money for years, living rent-free, and keeping my expenses low. I had about $20,000 in my savings account, and I told them I wanted to help. Not a loan, a gift. They were my parents, and this was what family did for each other. Mom cried when I offered. Dad tried to refuse at first, but I could see the relief in his eyes. They'd been stressed about money for months, trying to figure out how to afford Dad's procedure without touching their retirement savings. I wrote the check and felt good about it. Really good. Victoria called that weekend, her regular Sunday check-in. Mom mentioned the procedure and how I'd helped pay for it. I could hear the shift in Victoria's voice immediately. Wait, you paid for the whole thing? She asked. I was in the kitchen making coffee, but I could hear every word through the thin walls. Not all of it, Mom said, but he covered most of it. We're so grateful to have such a caring son. There was this long pause before Victoria said, "That's really generous of him." Something in her tone bothered me, but I shrugged it off. Victoria had always been a little competitive, even as kids. I figured she might feel guilty for not contributing, but that wasn't why I'd done it. 2 weeks later, Victoria called again, but this time she asked to speak to Dad privately. They talked for almost an hour, which was unusual. Victoria's calls were usually quick check-ins, 15 minutes max. After Dad hung up, he seemed different, quieter. When I asked if everything was okay, he just nodded and said Victoria was worried about their finances. Nothing more. The next Sunday, Victoria called and asked to talk to both parents together. Another long conversation. This time, when they hung up, both Mom and Dad looked at me differently. Not angry exactly, but suspicious? Confused? I couldn't put my finger on it. Everything all right? I asked. Mom and Dad exchanged this look, the kind married couples do when they're having a conversation without words. Victoria's concerned about our financial planning, Dad said carefully. She thinks we should be more careful about accepting help. I felt my stomach drop. What does that mean? She just wants to make sure we're thinking about the future, Mom said, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. That night, I heard them talking in their bedroom. The walls in our old house are thin, and I could catch pieces of their conversation. Words like taking advantage and his own interests and what Victoria said. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what I'd done wrong. I'd helped my parents when they needed it. I'd been there for them for 7 years. How was that taking advantage? The answer came the following week when my Uncle Frank called me. "Hey, kiddo," he said, and I could tell something was off. Uncle Frank was Dad's brother, and we'd always been close. "I wanted to check in with you about something." My heart started racing. "What's up?" Well, your sister called me yesterday. She's worried about your parents, says you might be pressuring them financially. Something about you living there rent-free and then getting them to pay for things. I nearly dropped the phone. What? Uncle Frank, that's not. I paid for Dad's procedure. I gave them money. That's not what Victoria told me, he said, and I could hear the confusion in his voice. She said you've been living there for years without contributing, and now you were talking them into expensive medical procedures they couldn't afford. I couldn't speak for a moment. The sheer audacity of it left me speechless. Uncle Frank, I said finally, Victoria has it backwards. I paid for Dad's procedure. I gave them $15,000. There was silence on the other end. Then, are you sure? Because Victoria seemed really concerned. She said she was thinking about moving back to help them out financially since they were struggling so much. That's when it hit me. Victoria wasn't worried about our parents. She was worried about her inheritance. After Uncle Frank's call, I realized Victoria's campaign was bigger than I thought. Over the next few days, I got similar calls from other relatives. Aunt Linda, Mom's sister, called to check in about the family's financial situation. Cousin Greg mentioned he'd heard our parents were having money troubles and wondered if they needed help. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Victoria had reached out to them first, painting a picture of financially struggling parents and a son who was taking advantage of the situation. According to her version of events, I was living rent-free, pressuring them into expensive medical treatments, and basically bleeding them dry. The worst part was how she'd twisted the truth just enough to make it believable. Yes, I lived with them rent-free. Yes, Dad had gotten an expensive procedure. Yes, they were on a fixed income. She just left out the tiny detail that I was the one who'd paid for everything. I tried talking to Mom and Dad about it, but they'd become distant. Conversations that used to flow naturally now felt strained. Dad would give me these searching looks, like he was trying to figure out my motives. Mom started insisting on paying for groceries when we went shopping together, even though I'd been covering that expense for months. The breaking point came 2 weeks later when Victoria announced she was coming home for a family meeting to discuss our parents' financial future. She arrived on a Thursday evening, rolling up in a rental car that probably cost more per day than I made in a week. I watched from my bedroom window as she got out, dressed in some designer outfit that screamed successful daughter who actually made something of herself. Dinner was awkward. Victoria dominated the conversation, talking about her job, her apartment, her latest business trip to New York. She kept making these subtle digs about responsibility and planning for the future, always directed at me. It's so important to think long-term, she said, cutting her salmon with precise movements. You can't just drift through life hoping someone else will take care of everything. I bit my tongue and focused on my food. After dinner, Victoria suggested we all sit down in the living room for a serious conversation. The way she said it made my skin crawl, like she was the parent and we were all children who needed to be managed. I've been thinking a lot about your financial situation, she began, looking at Mom and Dad with this expression of fake concern. And I'm worried you're not being careful enough about your money. Dad shifted uncomfortably in his recliner. We're doing fine, honey. Are you though? Victoria pulled out her phone and started scrolling through what looked like notes. Dad's procedure cost $15,000. That's a huge chunk of your retirement savings. Actually, I interrupted. I paid for that procedure. Victoria looked at me like I'd said something incredibly naive. Right, but where did that money come from? You've been living here rent-free for 7 years. By my calculations, that's at least $84,000 in housing costs you haven't paid. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Mom and Dad both turned to look at me, and I could see the doubt creeping into their eyes. So really, Victoria continued, you paid for Dad's procedure with money you should have been contributing to household expenses all along. I felt my face get hot. That's not how it works, Victoria. They invited me to stay here. I've been helping with groceries, utilities, maintenance. Have you though? She tilted her head like she was genuinely curious. Because I looked at their bank statements when I was here at Christmas, and I didn't see any regular contributions from you. Wait, she looked at their bank statements? Who does that? Victoria, Dad said quietly, that's not really it. Dad, I'm trying to help, she said, reaching over to pat his hand. You and Mom are too generous for your own good. You've let Connor live here rent-free for years, and now he's manipulating you into thinking he's being generous when he finally contributes something. Manipulating. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. I haven't manipulated anyone, I said, my voice shaking with anger. I moved back here to help take care of you both. I've been to every doctor's appointment, picked up prescriptions, handled repairs around the house. All while living rent-free, Victoria interrupted. And now you want credit for finally paying for something? Connor, that's not generosity. That's paying back a debt. Mom was looking between Victoria and me like she was watching a tennis match. Dad was staring at his hands, his face pale. "This is ridiculous," I said, standing up. "I can't believe you're twisting this into something selfish." "I'm not twisting anything," Victoria said calmly. "I'm just pointing out that actions have consequences. You chose to stay here instead of building a career. You chose to remain financially dependent on our parents. And now you're acting like you're some kind of hero for finally contributing." "Financially dependent?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Victoria, I have a job. I pay my own bills. I buy my own food most of the time. The only thing I don't pay for is rent, and that's because Mom and Dad insisted." "Of course they insisted," Victoria said. "They're your parents. They love you. But love doesn't pay for retirement or medical bills or home repairs." She turned back to Mom and Dad, her expression softening into something that looked like compassion but felt like manipulation. "I think I need to step up more," she said. "I've been so focused on my career that I lost sight of what really matters. Family." She paused for effect, letting that word hang in the air. "I'm thinking about moving back," she continued. "My company has remote work options now, and I could help out more financially. Make sure you're not being taken advantage of." The room went dead silent. Even the old grandfather clock in the corner seemed to stop ticking. "You want to move back?" Mom asked, and I could hear the hope in her voice. "I think it's time," Victoria said. "Connor's had his chance to figure things out, but maybe it's time for someone with better financial planning skills to take the lead." I stared at her, finally understanding what this was really about. This wasn't concern for our parents. This was Victoria realizing that if I kept living here and helping out, there might not be much inheritance left when they passed away. She was trying to push me out so she could swoop in and control their finances. "That's very thoughtful of you, honey," Dad said quietly. Victoria smiled, but when she looked at me, her eyes were cold as ice. "Connor, maybe this is a good opportunity for you to finally spread your wings," she said. "Get your own place. Build a real career. Stop depending on Mom and Dad for everything." I wanted to scream. I wanted to list every single thing I'd done for our parents over the past 7 years. Every doctor's appointment, every grocery run, every night I'd stayed awake worrying about Dad's heart or Mom's blood sugar. Instead, I just nodded and said, "I'll think about it." But I was already thinking about something else entirely. Victoria thought she was so smart, playing the long game and manipulating everyone around her. What she didn't know was that I'd been keeping records of everything. Every expense I'd covered, every contribution I'd made, every receipt, every bank statement, every insurance claim. If Victoria wanted to play games with numbers, I was about to show her what real accounting looked like. The next morning, Victoria was already up when I came downstairs for coffee. She was sitting at the kitchen table with Mom and Dad, a stack of papers spread out in front of them. Financial documents, by the look of it. "Morning, Connor," she said without looking up. "We're just going over some budget planning." "Budget planning?" "Right. More like inheritance protection planning." I poured my coffee and tried to act casual, but my stomach was churning. Whatever Victoria was showing them, it was working. Mom and Dad both looked serious and concerned, nodding along as she pointed to different numbers on the papers. "The important thing," I heard Victoria say, "is making sure you have enough set aside for emergencies. You can't afford to keep dipping into savings every time something comes up." Every time something comes up. Like Dad's life-saving medical procedure. I took my coffee and headed to my room, claiming I had work emails to catch up on. But really, I was planning my counterattack. See, Victoria made one crucial mistake. She assumed I was just some slacker who'd been coasting along without keeping track of anything. She didn't know that my business degree had actually taught me a few things about financial record keeping. For the past 7 years, I'd been meticulously documenting every expense I'd covered. Not because I planned to use it against anyone, but because I'm naturally organized and I wanted to make sure I was pulling my weight. I pulled out my laptop and opened the spreadsheet I'd been maintaining since I moved back home. 7 years of data, categorized and cross-referenced with bank statements and receipts. The numbers were staggering, even to me. Housing costs. Victoria was right that I hadn't paid rent, but she conveniently ignored everything else. I'd paid for a new roof in 2019, $8,500. A new HVAC system in 2021, $6,200, and countless smaller repairs and maintenance issues. Total, $18,430. Utilities. I've been covering the electric bill entirely since 2020, plus internet and cable. Total, $11,680. Groceries and household expenses. I've been the primary grocery shopper for 3 years, plus covering household supplies, cleaning products, and incidentals. Total, $22,340. Medical expenses. Beyond Dad's recent procedure, I'd covered copays, prescription costs not covered by Medicare, and transportation to appointments. Total, $19,250. Vehicle maintenance. Mom and Dad's car was getting old, and I'd covered major repairs to keep it running safely. Total, $4,800. The grand total was $76,500 over 7 years. Nearly $11,000 per year that I'd contributed to the household. But that was just the money. The spreadsheet didn't capture the countless hours I'd spent driving them to appointments, staying up late when Dad had chest pains, researching treatment options, or simply being there to provide companionship and support. I spent the morning compiling everything into a comprehensive report. Bank statements, receipts, appointment records, repair invoices. Everything organized chronologically with clear summaries and totals. Then I did something that felt a little petty but absolutely necessary. I calculated what Victoria would have paid if she'd been contributing equally to our parents' care over the past 7 years. Half of all the expenses I'd covered, plus her share of rent for the time she'd stayed in the guest room during visits. The total came to $41,750. I was just finishing up when I heard voices in the living room. Victoria was on the phone with someone, probably another relative, spreading her version of events. I know, it's such a difficult situation, I heard her saying. They're too generous for their own good, and Connor's just taking advantage of that. I'm trying to help them see that they need to be more careful about their finances. That afternoon, Victoria announced she was taking Mom and Dad out to lunch to discuss next steps. They invited me to come along, but I declined. I had some phone calls to make. I spent the afternoon reaching out to every relative Victoria had contacted. Uncle Frank, Aunt Linda, Cousin Greg, and a few others. The conversations were enlightening. Connor, I have to tell you, I was concerned after talking to Victoria, Uncle Frank admitted. But now I'm wondering if I got the whole story. I didn't go into details over the phone. Instead, I told each of them that I was putting together some information to clarify the situation, and I'd be sending it to them soon. When Mom, Dad, and Victoria got back from lunch, the atmosphere in the house was tense. Victoria looked pleased with herself, while Mom and Dad seemed uncomfortable. How was lunch? I asked. Very productive, Victoria said. We talked about setting up a more structured financial plan going forward. That evening, Victoria cornered me in the kitchen while Mom and Dad were watching TV. Connor, I hope you understand this isn't personal, she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. I'm just looking out for our parents' best interests. I looked at her for a long moment, the sister I'd once looked up to, and realized I didn't recognize her anymore. Somewhere along the way, she'd become someone who could look at our parents' struggles and see only dollar signs. You're right, Victoria, I said. It's not personal. It's business. And I'm pretty good with numbers too. She frowned, not sure what I meant. I've been putting together some financial records, I continued, just to make sure everyone has the complete picture. Her frown deepened. What kind of records? Oh, you know, expenses, contributions, that sort of thing. I think the family should see exactly how the finances have been handled over the past 7 years. For the first time since she'd arrived, Victoria looked uncertain. Connor, I hope you're not planning to make this more complicated than it needs to be. I smiled, and I could tell it unsettled her. Not complicated at all, I said. Just transparent. Isn't that what you want? Complete financial transparency? That night, I finalized my report and prepared to send it out. 23 pages of documented proof that Victoria's narrative was not just wrong, but deliberately misleading. But I decided to give Victoria one more chance. The next morning, I knocked on the guest room door where she was staying. Come in, she called. She was sitting on the bed with her laptop, probably working on her next phase of manipulation. Victoria, I want to give you an opportunity to set the record straight with the family, I said. She looked up from her screen. What do you mean? I held up a printed copy of my report. I mean, you can call everyone back and explain that you made some mistakes in your assessment of the situation. Or I can send this out and let them draw their own conclusions. She set her laptop aside and reached for the report. I watched her face as she flipped through the pages, her expression shifting from confusion to shock to something that looked like panic. Where did you get all this? She asked quietly. I kept records, Victoria. Of everything. Every expense, every contribution, every receipt. All the things you accused me of not doing. She was quiet for a long time, reading through the detailed breakdown of my contributions. Connor, I didn't realize. Yes, you did, I said. You just didn't care. You saw an opportunity to position yourself as the responsible daughter and me as the freeloader, and you took it. She closed the report and looked up at me, and for a moment I saw something that might have been shame in her eyes. What do you want? She asked. I want you to tell the truth, I said. To everyone. Mom, Dad, Uncle Frank, everyone you called. Victoria stared at the report in her hands, and I could practically see the wheels turning in her head. She was calculating, trying to figure out if there was a way to spin this in her favor. And if I don't, she asked. I pulled out my phone and showed her my email, already composed with the report attached and a list of recipients that included every family member she'd contacted. Then I send this out in 1 hour, and everyone can decide for themselves who's been taking advantage of whom. Victoria stared at my phone screen for a long moment, reading the list of email recipients. I could see her mind racing, trying to find an angle, a way to salvage her narrative. But the numbers in that report were damning, and she knew it. Connor, maybe we can work something out, she said finally, her voice lacking its usual confidence. There's nothing to work out, I replied. Either you tell the truth, or I will. She set the report down on the bed and ran her hands through her hair. For the first time since she'd arrived, she looked genuinely rattled. I need to think about this, she said. You have 58 minutes, I said, checking my phone. Then I hit send. I left her alone and went downstairs. Mom and Dad were in the kitchen having breakfast, but the easy comfort that used to characterize our morning routines was gone. Everything felt strained and artificial. Morning, Dad said without looking up from his newspaper. Morning, I replied, pouring myself coffee. Mom was stirring her oatmeal absently, lost in thought. After a moment, she looked up at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. Connor, honey, we need to talk about your future plans, she said gently. I sat down across from them, my coffee mug warming my hands. What about them? Well, Dad said, finally looking at me, Victoria made some good points yesterday about you needing to establish more independence. My heart sank. Victoria's manipulation was working even better than I'd thought. Maybe it's time for you to get your own place, Mom continued. You're almost 30, and you should be building your own life. I looked at these two people who'd raised me, who'd taught me the importance of family and taking care of each other, and I realized Victoria had poisoned them against me more thoroughly than I'd imagined. Is that what you want? I asked quietly. They exchanged one of their wordless married couple looks before Dad answered. We want what's best for you, son. And we're starting to think that maybe we've made it too easy for you to avoid growing up. Avoid growing up. The words hit me like a slap. 23 minutes later, Victoria came downstairs. She looked like she'd been crying, which was unusual for her. Victoria wasn't a crier. Mom, Dad, she said, her voice shaky. I need to tell you something. She sat down at the table, and I could see her hands trembling slightly. I made some mistakes, she began. About Connor's situation. About the finances. Mom and Dad looked confused. What kind of mistakes? Dad asked. Victoria glanced at me, then took a deep breath. I accused Connor of taking advantage of you financially, but I was wrong. Really wrong. The kitchen went silent except for the ticking of the old wall clock. I don't understand, Mom said. Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper. Connor hasn't been taking advantage of you. He's been taking care of you. I didn't want to see it. Over the next 10 minutes, Victoria laid out the truth. Not all of it, and not without trying to soften her own role in the deception, but enough to make Mom and Dad understand what had really been happening. She admitted that I'd been covering major household expenses. She admitted that I'd paid for Dad's procedure entirely out of my own savings. She admitted that she'd twisted the facts when she called other family members. What she didn't admit was that this had all been a calculated attempt to protect her inheritance. Some truths were apparently too ugly even for a confession. When she finished, the silence in the kitchen was deafening. Dad was the first to speak. Connor, is this true? I nodded. I have documentation if you want to see it. Why didn't you tell us about all the expenses you were covering? Mom asked, her eyes filling with tears. Because I didn't want you to feel guilty about accepting help, I said. And because I didn't think I needed to keep score. You're my parents. Dad put his head in his hands. We owe you an apology, son. A big one. You don't owe me anything, I said. I helped because I wanted to help. But even as I said it, I felt the weight of everything that had happened. Victoria's accusations. Mom and Dad's willingness to believe them. The conversations about me needing to move out and grow up. Some damage couldn't be undone with just an apology. Victoria excused herself and went upstairs to pack. Her flight back to Los Angeles was that evening, and suddenly everyone seemed eager for her to be on it. After she left the kitchen, Mom reached across the table and took my hand. Connor, we're so sorry, she said, tears streaming down her face. We should have known better. We should have trusted you. I don't understand how we let Victoria convince us otherwise, Dad added, shaking his head. Everything she said went against everything we know about you. That afternoon, I sent out a modified version of my report to the family members Victoria had contacted. Not the full 23 pages, but a summary that set the record straight. The responses started coming in within hours. Uncle Frank called to apologize and tell me he'd never doubted my character. Not really. Aunt Linda sent a long email expressing her regret for believing Victoria's version of events. Cousin Greg texted to say he'd always known I was the good one in the family. But the damage to my relationship with Mom and Dad was harder to repair. They were genuinely remorseful, but I couldn't forget how quickly they turned against me. How readily they believed that I was manipulating them after 7 years of demonstrated loyalty and care. Victoria's flight was delayed, so she didn't leave until late that night. She tried to talk to me before she left, cornering me in the hallway as I headed to my room. "Connor, I want you to know I'm sorry," she said. "I was wrong about everything." I looked at her, this person who'd been my big sister, my role model when we were kids. "No, Victoria," I said. "You weren't wrong. You knew exactly what you were doing." She flinched like I'd hit her. "You saw Mom and Dad getting older and realized that every dollar they spent on medical care or home repairs was a dollar that wouldn't be in your inheritance. So you decided to paint me as the villain and position yourself as their financial savior. That's not it." "Yes, it is," I interrupted. "And the worst part is that it almost worked. Mom and Dad were ready to kick me out of the house based on your lies." Victoria's face crumpled, and for a moment she looked like the little girl who used to follow me around when we were kids. "I was scared," she admitted. "Scared that I'd been a terrible daughter. Scared that you were the good one, and I was just the selfish one who moved away. So you decided to tear me down instead of building yourself up?" She didn't have an answer for that. 2 weeks later, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I moved out. Not because Mom and Dad wanted me to, and not because Victoria had been right about me needing independence. I moved out because I realized that staying would mean pretending this whole thing had never happened, and I wasn't ready to do that. I found a small apartment across town, close enough to help when needed, but far enough to establish some boundaries. Mom cried when I told them, and Dad offered to help with the security deposit, but I declined. I continued helping with doctor's appointments and major expenses, but I did it on my own terms now. No more living in their house. No more blurred lines about who was supporting whom. Victoria never did move back home. Her remote work offer apparently fell through, or maybe she just realized that playing the devoted daughter was harder than it looked from a distance. 6 months later, Dad needed another procedure. A minor one this time, but still expensive. He called to ask if I could help with the costs, his voice hesitant and embarrassed. "Of course," I said without hesitation. "How much do you need?" "Connor," he said quietly, "I want you to know that we'll pay you back. Every penny." "Dad, you don't need to." "Yes, we do," he interrupted. "We took your generosity for granted once. We won't make that mistake again. I still help my parents. I still cover medical expenses and major repairs and whatever else they need. But the dynamic is different now. They don't assume I'll pay for things, and I don't assume they'll always have my back. Victoria visits twice a year, same as before. But now her visits are shorter, and the conversation is more careful. We're polite to each other, but the easy sibling relationship we once had is gone, probably forever. Sometimes I wonder if I should have just let it slide, taken the high road and pretended Victoria's accusations hadn't hurt as much as they did. But then I remember how quickly Mom and Dad turned against me, and I know I made the right choice. Family loyalty shouldn't be a one-way street. And sometimes the people who love you the most are the ones most capable of breaking your heart. I learned that the hard way, but I learned it completely. And that knowledge, painful as it was, turned out to be worth more than any inheritance Victoria was worried about protecting.